On my wedding day, my cruel mother-in-law humiliated me in front of my entire family. You're just the daughter of a groundskeeper. My son could have anyone on his social level, not a penniless nobody like you who doesn't belong in our world," she sneered mockingly. But she never imagined that months later. Chloe adjusted the pleats of her simple wedding dress. Her hands trembled as she looked at herself in the mirror of the small church room where they had left her to get ready. The white fabric was soft, but it wasn't silk or high-end luxury. It was a dress her mother had sewn with dedication and love. "This is enough," she told herself over and over, but deep down, the weight of the difference between her world and Ethan's crushed her heart. She couldn't help but recall the scornful looks she had received from his family over the past few months. Her father, Julian, a strong man with hands hardened by years of working the land, peeked through the door with a proud smile, but his eyes showed a slight worry. "You look beautiful, honey," he said, stepping in slowly so as not to wrinkle his slightly worn but clean shirt. Chloe smiled weakly, grateful for his attempt to reassure her. She knew her father had done everything possible to support her, even with all the doubts he also had. But how could she feel secure when Ethan's parents, seated among the guests outside, didn't accept her? Her love for Ethan was undeniable, but the reality they faced weighed more heavily each day. "Thanks, Dad," she replied, taking his hand affectionately. "But I can't stop thinking about what's about to happen out there." Julian sighed, moving closer and placing a hand on her shoulder. "The only thing that matters is that you two love each other. Everything else you'll figure out together." Chloe nodded, though she couldn't help but think of the biting words Charles and Susan, Ethan's parents, had hurled more than once. "She's just the groundskeeper's daughter," Susan had said, as if it were a life sentence. "He could have anyone, someone of his standing," the family's friends whispered. But Ethan had never wavered. He always defended her, always chose her. That kept her strong, even as the voices of contempt echoed in her head. The sound of the guests beginning to settle outside the church signaled that the moment was near. Her heart pounded, and she took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Julian, sensing his daughter's nervousness, squeezed her hand once more. "Ethan loves you. That's all that matters today." Chloe smiled, her eyes moist with emotion, and nodded. She knew it was true, but she couldn't ignore the weight of the stares she would feel once she crossed those doors. Outside, Ethan stood at the altar, trying not to show his own anxiety. He knew what was coming. He knew what his parents had prepared, especially his father, Charles, who had been clear with him in private. "If you marry that girl," Charles had said, his voice low and controlled, "you'll be signing your exit from this family. You will be disinherited, Ethan. There will be no turning back." The warning kept ringing in his head. Susan, his mother, more diplomatic but equally calculating, had tried to dissuade him more subtly. "Ethan, you can have everything you've ever dreamed of," she had told him softly. "But with her, it will be a difficult life. She's not on your level. She doesn't understand our world. Don't let this mistake ruin your future." Ethan, however, could not be convinced. He loved Chloe and knew what they shared was authentic, far more genuine than any superficial relationship his family would have wanted for him. He knew that money and power couldn't replace what he felt for her. Still, his family's pressure haunted him like a shadow. When the church doors opened and Chloe appeared in the doorway, all thoughts vanished. Ethan saw her, and nothing else mattered. She was his anchor, the reason he was willing to defy everything. Chloe walked slowly toward him, the sheen of tears in her eyes reflecting the mix of emotions they both shared. In the front row, Charles looked at his son with coldness. Susan, with an expression of resignation, kept her head held high, but her disdain for the bride was obvious to everyone around her. Chloe felt her steps heavy, but when her eyes met Ethan's, something inside her calmed. There he was, her refuge, her love. It was so palpable that she was able to forget the people who looked at her with judgments disguised as polite smiles. When she reached the altar, Ethan took her hands in his, squeezing them gently. "We're in this together, Chloe," he whispered. She nodded, barely holding back her tears. She knew what came next wouldn't be easy. The priest began with the formalities, but before he reached the crucial moment of the vows, Charles rose from his seat. The whispers among the guests intensified. Ethan frowned, knowing his father wouldn't miss the opportunity to make his final declaration. "Excuse me, Father," Charles said, interrupting the rhythm of the ceremony. "But I believe I have something to say before we continue." The confused priest paused and looked at Ethan for a sign, but Charles didn't wait for a response. He addressed the guests, his voice clear and authoritative. "As the father of the groom, I feel it is my duty to ensure everyone here understands what is happening today." Chloe felt the weight of Charles's every word like a direct blow to her stomach. Ethan tensed, ready to intervene, but Charles continued. Today my son Ethan is marrying Chloe, the groundskeeper's daughter. I am not here to insult anyone, but to make clear what this means for our family. The murmurs among the guests grew louder as eyes turned toward Chloe, some with sympathy, others filled with judgment. Ethan has chosen to ignore everything we have done for him, everything we have built together as a family, to marry a woman who is clearly not on his level. Chloe felt the air escape her chest, but before she could react, Ethan released her hands and stepped forward. Enough, Dad, Ethan said, his voice firm and filled with contained anger. Charles didn't seem affected by his son's words. He looked at him with a coldness that only those closest to him knew. I'm sorry, son, but if you choose to go through with this, you are forfeiting your inheritance, your place in the family, everything. There will be no turning back. The room fell silent. Guests held their breath, awaiting Ethan's response. Everyone knew this moment would change everything. Ethan stood motionless before his father, feeling the weight of his words fall upon him with overwhelming force. The hall, which had been full of whispers and glances, now seemed like an unfathomable void where only Charles's words resonated. You will give up everything. Chloe, at his side, looked at him with her heart in her throat, her eyes shining with uncertainty, hoping he would look at her, that he would reassure her somehow. But at that moment, all Ethan could feel was a mixture of rage and pain. Charles, still standing, observed his son with a cold, calculating gaze, as if to remind him who held the power in that room. But what he didn't understand was that Ethan had already made a decision long before that day. Dad, Ethan said finally, his voice low but firm, I know what this means to you. I know what you expected from me, what you always wanted me to do. But this is my life, and I am choosing Chloe because I love her, because I know that with her, I can be happy. Charles frowned, as if those words were meaningless to him. Love, you say? His voice was laced with disdain. Ethan, love doesn't fill bank accounts. It doesn't open doors. It doesn't give you the respect you need to keep building an empire. Do you really believe that with her by your side, you can have the future we have prepared for you? Susan, Ethan's mother, remained seated, watching the scene with an expression of resignation, but not without a small spark of sadness. She knew there was no going back, and although she wanted her son to make a decision that would benefit the family, she couldn't help but feel the pain all this was causing. Charles, please, Susan whispered, trying to soften the atmosphere. This is not the time for this. But Charles didn't listen to her. He was determined that his son understand the price of his decision. Ethan, gritting his teeth, looked his father directly in the eyes. The silence in the hall was deafening. Every person present held their breath, aware that what was happening was not just a family conflict, but a silent war for Ethan's soul. I don't need your money or your respect to be happy, Ethan continued, his voice firmer. I've realized that what you offer me is a golden cage. And, he turned to Chloe, taking her hand gently. She offers me freedom. She is everything I need to feel complete. Chloe, upon hearing those words, felt tears threaten to fall from her eyes. Ethan had always been her rock, but in that moment, as he confronted his own father for her, she understood the true extent of the sacrifice he was making. The love he professed for her was not superficial or fleeting. It was a promise of life, of a future together, even if the circumstances were against them. Charles clenched his fists, clearly frustrated by his son's lack of obedience. Since Ethan was a child, he had imagined a glorious future for him, full of success and power, controlling the family business and taking the surname to new heights. But now, all that effort seemed to crumble before his eyes because of a woman who, according to him, had nothing to offer. You are making the mistake of your life, Charles spat out, looking at Ethan as if he were observing a stranger. This woman will lead you to ruin, and when that happens, don't expect us to lend a hand. The cruelty of those words made Chloe lower her head, but Ethan was not affected. He squeezed Chloe's hand harder, determined not to let his father break the love they had built with so much effort. And then I won't have to come back, Ethan replied with serenity, though his heart was pounding fiercely. If living with her means losing everything else, then I accept it. Charles shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He took a step back, setting down the microphone, clearly defeated in his attempt to control the situation. The hall remained silent, but this time it was not due to the tension between father and son, but because of the astonishment of the guests at what they had just witnessed. It was rare to see someone like Ethan so openly defy his powerful family. Finally, it was Susan who stood up. She walked toward her son with eyes full of conflicting emotions. She had hoped things wouldn't come to this point, but there was nothing more she could do. She stopped in front of him, looking at Chloe for a brief moment before turning back to her son. "Ethan," she said softly with a contained sadness, "you know what this means for your future, don't you? You know we can't continue if you choose this path." Ethan looked at her, knowing those words came from a mother who loved him, but also from a woman trapped in a world of expectations and unbreakable rules. "I know, Mom," he replied in a softer tone, "but this is the future I want. Chloe is my family now." Susan nodded without saying anything more. She knew her son had already made his decision, and no matter how much it hurt, she wouldn't fight any longer. She gave a sad look to her husband, who had already returned to his seat, defeated in his attempt to control the situation. When Susan returned to her seat, the ceremony continued, although the atmosphere remained charged with a tense and strange energy. Ethan and Chloe exchanged vows, both aware that their path together wouldn't be easy. But as they held hands and looked into each other's eyes, they knew that what they had shared, what they had sacrificed, was worth more than any fortune or inheritance. "I love you," Ethan whispered as he placed the ring on her finger, his words full of a promise of the future. Chloe, with eyes full of tears, responded with a warm smile, one that made her feel that despite everything, they were in the right place. The ceremony ended amidst timid applause and some murmurs. The guests knew that what they had just witnessed was more than a wedding. It was an act of rebellion, a declaration of love that challenged power and money. As Ethan and Chloe walked out together, hand in hand, they knew that even if the road ahead was full of difficulties, they had already won the most important battle, that of choosing their own destiny, no matter the cost. And as they crossed the threshold of the church, they realized that together, they could face anything. The beginning of the struggle and the revelation. The first few months after the wedding were like a dream for Ethan and Chloe. Despite everything they had left behind, they had each other, and at first that seemed enough. The small apartment they rented in a modest neighborhood felt warm, full of love and hope. Chloe took care of decorating it simply, but with a personal touch that made every corner radiate her essence. Ethan, meanwhile, worked tirelessly, seeking new opportunities to build his life with her, far from his family's shadows. However, that peace was fleeting. The first signs came when Ethan began to notice that doors that had previously opened easily now closed in his face. Companies he had worked with in the past no longer received him. Meetings that were once automatic were now impossible to secure. At first, he thought it was a coincidence, or perhaps the natural adjustment of having given up his family's support. But he soon realized something more sinister was afoot. One afternoon after a failed meeting, Ethan sat alone in a coffee shop, observing his reflection in the window. He felt defeated, as if the weight of the decision to confront his father was finally starting to take its toll. Then his phone rang. It was Hector, an old family friend who had also worked at his father's company. Hector's tone was solemn, almost compassionate. "Ethan, I wanted to call you so you'd know from me, not someone else," Hector said, his voice low. "Your father has spoken to everyone. He's made sure that no partner, no reputable company will offer you work. He's made it clear that anyone who supports you or Chloe will be confronting him." Ethan felt his stomach sink. He knew his father was a powerful man, but he never imagined he would go that far. "He's doing it for revenge?" Ethan asked, although deep down he already knew the answer. Hector paused, as if unsure exactly what to say. "It's not just revenge. He wants you back, but on his terms. He says everything can be fixed if you leave Chloe and return to the family." Ethan clenched his fist on the table, feeling a helpless rage rise in his throat. He knew his father saw everything as a power play, another strategy to control him. But this was not a business. It was his life, his marriage, his love for Chloe. "That's not going to happen, Hector. I won't leave Chloe," Ethan replied, his voice trembling with contained anger. "No matter what he does." "I know, but be careful, Ethan," Hector said in a graver tone. "He's bent on destroying any opportunity you have, and I think this is just the beginning." Ethan hung up the phone, feeling as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. He knew confronting his father would have consequences, but he never imagined he would go this far. Ethan, a man accustomed to forging his own destiny, realized he was caught in a net he couldn't control. He knew his father had the power to erase his reputation in the business world, and that was starting to destroy his opportunities to maintain his home. When he got home that night, Chloe was waiting for him, as always, with a warm and worried smile. But tonight, Chloe's smile wasn't enough to lift Ethan's spirits. He sat on the sofa without saying a word, his shoulders slumped and his gaze lost. "What happened, Ethan?" Chloe asked softly, sitting beside him. Ethan looked at her, and for the first time in a long time he didn't know what to say. He knew she already felt the tension, that money was beginning to run low and opportunities were fading. But telling her that everything was part of his father's plan made him feel even more helpless. "My father has made sure I can't work anywhere he has influence," he finally said, his voice flat. Chloe looked at him in silence for a moment, assimilating what that meant. She knew Charles was capable of many things, but it was still hard for her to accept that someone could do something so cruel, even to their own son. "And what does he want?" Chloe asked, though she already knew the answer. "He wants me to leave you. He wants me to go back and do things his way, as always." Ethan let out a bitter sigh. "He says if I leave you, he'll give me everything back. I can have the life he always wanted for me." Chloe felt a knot in her stomach. It wasn't the first time she wondered if their love was destroying Ethan's life. She knew he had lost everything to be with her, and although he had never said it, she feared that at some point, that burden would be too much for him. But when their eyes met, she saw the same determination in Ethan's eyes that had won her over from the start. "Ethan, I can't ask you to keep losing everything for me," Chloe said, her voice a thread. Ethan looked at her, astonished that she would even think that. He took her hand firmly, as if he feared his father's words could tear her away from him. "You're not asking me. I chose this. I chose you, and I would do it 1,000 times over." His voice cracked, but his gaze was firm. "I won't let him win. I won't leave you." Chloe felt tears fall down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the love and strength Ethan was showing her in that moment. But they both knew the path they were on was uncertain, and that Charles's shadow would not stop pursuing them. The following weeks were even tougher. Money began to run out, and with every closed door, Ethan felt more helpless. He looked for work wherever he could, but the rumors had already spread. Ethan, the rebel son, was blacklisted. Even in places where his family had no direct influence, his name had become synonymous with trouble. Chloe tried to contribute what she could, but her skills and connections were not enough to keep them afloat. One day, as Ethan sat in the small kitchen reviewing the few work options he had left, the phone rang again. This time it wasn't Hector, it was his father. "You know this doesn't have to be this way, Ethan," Charles said, his voice soft but filled with the cold authority he had always wielded over him. "Everything can go back to how it was. You just have to make the right decision." Ethan gripped the phone. Rage boiled inside him, but he tried to stay calm. "The right decision according to you, Dad. Not according to what I feel. I'm not leaving Chloe." Charles paused, as if evaluating the situation before continuing. "Very well, then let's continue with this game. Let's see how much longer you can hold out without anything. When you run out of options, you'll know where to find me." Ethan hung up the phone, feeling more defeated than ever. He knew his father wouldn't give in, but neither would he. However, the weight of the situation was beginning to crush him. Chloe entered the kitchen at that moment, seeing the expression on Ethan's face. "It was your father, wasn't it?" she asked with a mixture of concern and resignation. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. He stood up, hugging her tightly. Chloe nestled into his chest, and in that moment, they both understood that what was at stake was not just their love, but their ability to resist an unrelenting power that sought to separate them. But as Ethan gently stroked Chloe's hair, he realized something. His father could take everything from him except the most important thing. A new hope, the business idea. Time kept passing, and the difficulties seemed to multiply for Ethan and Chloe. Money was scarcer than ever, and work opportunities for Ethan vanished at a relentless pace. But in the midst of that storm, a piece of news arrived that would change their lives forever. One afternoon, while Ethan was out looking for work, Chloe sat in the small bathroom of their apartment, holding a pregnancy test in her hands. Her heart pounded. The result was clear. She was pregnant. Mixed feelings swirled inside her. On one hand, the immense joy of knowing she was going to be a mother, but on the other, the fear of what that would mean amidst the difficulties they were already facing. When Ethan came home, exhausted and looking downcast after another unsuccessful day, he found Chloe sitting on the sofa with tears in her eyes. But this time, not tears of sadness. Unsure what was happening, Ethan quickly approached, worried. "What's wrong, honey?" he asked, kneeling in front of her. Chloe took his hands and gave him a small, tearful smile. "I'm pregnant, Ethan." For a moment, Ethan's world seemed to stop. His mind tried to process what he had just heard. A child, a baby. Despite all the chaos surrounding their lives, that news filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. Slowly, a smile spread across his face, and tears began to fill his eyes, too. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "We're going to be parents." Chloe nodded, and in that moment, Ethan hugged her tightly, both letting the tears of joy fall freely. For the first time in months, there was a ray of hope amidst so much darkness. A child, that little being they didn't yet know, already gave them a new reason to fight. However, reality soon set in. With the baby's arrival, their needs would multiply, and they knew they had to find a way to get ahead and fast. It was then that Chloe remembered one of the few talents she had always enjoyed: baking. Chloe had learned to bake since she was little with her mother in the kitchen of their modest house. It was something that made her happy and had more than once surprised those who tasted them. At that moment, she thought that perhaps that skill could be the answer they were looking for. "Ethan," Chloe said one night while they were having dinner, "I've been thinking. I could start selling cakes and pastries. I know it's not much, but if we sell them online, maybe we can earn some money." Ethan looked at her with interest. He knew Chloe's baked goods were incredible, but it hadn't occurred to him that they could sell them as a source of income. "You think so?" he asked, although he could already imagine the potential of the idea. "I could help you with the deliveries and we can create a page to promote them." Chloe nodded enthusiastically, glad he agreed. That night, they stayed up late designing a plan. Ethan, with his basic knowledge of technology, created a simple social media page where they could post photos of the baked goods Chloe would start preparing. She, for her part, began experimenting with new recipes and decorations, wanting to offer something special. The first few weeks were slow. They sold a couple of cakes here and there, delivering them to local customers who found their page. Ethan was in charge of making the deliveries by bicycle, as they couldn't afford a car. At first, it wasn't much, but every time he returned from a delivery, he brought a smile with him. "People love your cakes," Ethan would say excitedly. "Today, someone told me they're the best they've ever tasted." Chloe, despite the fatigue from the pregnancy and the long hours in the kitchen, felt they were finally finding a way to get ahead. With every order, her confidence grew. The small kitchen of the apartment had become an improvised bakery workshop, with flour and sugar scattered everywhere and the sweet aroma of baking permeating every corner. One day, while Ethan was making a delivery to a regular customer, a man in a suit waiting at the entrance of a large office building, something caught his attention. The man, who seemed to be observing the box of baked goods Ethan held with interest, approached him curiously. "Are those your cakes?" the man asked with a friendly smile. "They're my wife's," Ethan replied with the same friendliness. "I just do the deliveries." The man nodded, looking at the box intently. "I work for a coffee shop chain," he said, introducing himself as Robert, a manager for a major local food company. "We're looking for something different to offer in our locations, and your pastries have a great presentation. Would you mind if we tasted them at our main cafe? If you like, we could strike a deal for you to supply us regularly." Ethan was speechless for a moment. It was a real opportunity. After everything they had been through, could this be the turning point they needed? "Of course," he finally replied, feeling adrenaline rush through his body. "I can bring a bigger sample next week." When Ethan arrived home that afternoon, he could barely contain his excitement. "Chloe, you won't believe what happened," he said, rushing into the apartment. "A manager from a coffee shop chain wants to sample your cakes. It could be a huge opportunity." Chloe looked at him, surprised, her eyes wide. "Really?" she asked, as if she couldn't believe it. Ethan nodded, hugging her tightly. "We're going to do it, Chloe. This may be what we've been waiting for." That night, as Ethan and Chloe hugged in the small bed they shared, they felt more optimistic than they had in months. They knew the road would still be difficult, but now there was a possibility, a spark of hope that wasn't there before. And above all, they were doing it together. The following week, Chloe prepared her best cakes, and Ethan ensured the delivery was impeccable. They took them to the chain's main cafe, and Robert, the manager, was impressed, both by the quality of the product and the story behind them. A couple of days later, they received the call that would change their lives. "We love your cakes," Robert said. "We want to enter into a contract for you to supply us weekly." Ethan and Chloe couldn't believe it. For the first time after so much struggle and sacrifice, there was a real opportunity to get ahead. They were beginning to build something of their own, something that no one, not even Charles, could take away from them. As Chloe caressed her now more noticeable belly and Ethan watched her with a smile full of love and pride, they knew that despite all the difficulties, they had won the most important battle. That of staying together, facing everything life threw at them. And now, with the hope of a better future for themselves and for their child. The new bakery and the birth of Sophia. The months that followed the contract with the coffee shop chain brought a significant change in Ethan and Chloe's lives. Slowly, orders increased, and what began as a small venture to survive turned into a growing business. Chloe, with her increasingly prominent belly, spent long hours in the kitchen, creating new recipes and ensuring every cake was perfect. Meanwhile, Ethan, always willing, handled deliveries, logistics, and began managing the accounts and contracts that came from the growing popularity of the baked goods. However, success did not come without its own challenges. The work began to be exhausting for Chloe, and the pregnancy in its last trimester left her without energy. As the days advanced, one afternoon, while she was leaning over the counter, decorating a cake for a new delivery, she felt a sharp pain in her back that forced her to stop. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the pain didn't subside. Ethan, who was outside checking some paperwork, entered at that moment and saw her hunched over, her face tense with pain. "Are you okay, honey?" he asked worriedly, approaching her quickly. She tried to smile to reassure him, but the pain wouldn't let her pretend. I think the baby is just restless today," she replied, although the discomfort was evident. Ethan watched her with concern. He knew that even though Chloe was incredibly strong, he couldn't ignore the fact that her body needed rest. He crouched beside her, taking her hand gently. "Chloe, you should rest a bit. You've been working too hard," he said tenderly but firmly. She shook her head gently. "We have so many orders, Ethan. We can't stop now. This is what's carrying us forward." Ethan caressed her cheek, his face reflecting the mixture of love and concern he felt. "I know, but your health and the baby's are more important than any cake. Let me take care of the rest for today. Please rest." Chloe finally nodded, realizing she couldn't keep ignoring the signals from her body. Ethan guided her to the sofa and helped her sit comfortably. Then he returned to the kitchen, determined to finish the order himself. That night, while Chloe rested, Ethan reviewed the finances and upcoming orders. The business was growing faster than they had anticipated, and while that was a cause for joy, it also meant they had to find a way to handle the workload. Hiring help would be the most sensible thing, but they were still recovering financially and couldn't afford large expenses. The next morning, while having breakfast together, Chloe took her teacup and looked at Ethan thoughtfully. "I've been thinking maybe we should look for a small commercial space," she said, surprising Ethan. "A space?" he asked, looking up from the newspaper. "Don't you think it's a bit soon for that?" Chloe smiled, her eyes gleaming with enthusiasm. "It's not too soon. If we keep growing at this rate, we'll need more room. Besides, if we have our own place, we could hire someone to help me in the kitchen. We can't keep working only from home once the baby is here." Ethan pondered for a moment. The idea of having their own storefront had always been a dream, but the circumstances of the last few months had kept him focused only on survival. However, hearing Chloe speak with such hope, he knew that dream was closer than they thought. "You're right," he finally said with a smile. "Let's start looking. It won't be easy, but if we find the right place, we can take the next step." Chloe returned his smile, feeling immense relief. Although the path until that moment had been difficult, there was now a new horizon full of possibilities. The following weeks were filled with excitement and nervousness. Ethan handled deliveries and continued scouting for potential spaces, while Chloe, despite her advanced pregnancy, continued to manage orders from home with the occasional help of a neighbor who offered assistance. Finally, one day, after weeks of searching, they found a small space downtown, right next to a popular cafe. It was modest, but it had everything they needed: a spacious kitchen, a customer service area, and a storefront that could attract passers-by. The rent was fair, and with a little effort, they knew they could turn it into something special. "This is the place," Chloe said excitedly, touring the space. "I can already imagine how I'll decorate it, and how it will look filled with fresh cakes. I can see it all, Ethan. It will be our home away from home." Ethan watched her, feeling a mixture of pride and love. Despite everything they had been through, they were building something of their own, something no one could take away from them. "We'll make it happen," Ethan promised, taking her hand. "This will be our next step." With the contract signed and the keys in hand, they began the renovations. It was a slow process as they were still managing orders while preparing the space for the opening, but with each passing day, the place was transforming, and with it their lives. One afternoon, while painting the walls of the new storefront, Chloe paused, her hand over her belly. "I think the baby is excited too," she said with a smile. "It's moving a lot today." Ethan quickly approached, placing his hand on Chloe's belly, feeling the small movements. "He's going to be a great baker, I can already tell," he joked, his eyes full of love. Chloe laughed, but her laughter was interrupted by a small moan of pain. Ethan looked at her, worried. "Are you okay?" She nodded, although the pain was evident. "I think it's just the baby getting comfortable." but maybe we should go home and rest. Ethan didn't hesitate. He knew the last few weeks had been exhausting for both of them, but especially for Chloe. They put down their tools and returned home, knowing that although there was much to do, the most important thing was Chloe's and the baby's health. The business was underway, the plans were moving forward, and the future was beginning to take shape. Every day, despite the challenges, Chloe and Ethan felt closer to achieving their dreams. They knew the road hadn't been easy, but they also knew they had walked it together, and that made them invincible. And although the problems and the shadows of the past were still present, the success they were building with their own hands was the best testament that love and perseverance could overcome even the highest barriers. The grand opening and the unexpected encounter. Ethan and Chloe had been working tirelessly to finalize the details of the new storefront. The grand opening day was approaching, and although both were exhausted from the long working hours, there was a mixture of excitement and nervousness in the air. The dream of owning their own business was about to come true, but the pressure for everything to go well was starting to weigh heavily, especially with the baby so close to arriving. One morning, while Chloe was finishing organizing the display cases of the new space, she felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. At first, she thought it was just another discomfort of the pregnancy, but this time the pain was stronger, and a feeling of unease flooded her. She stopped, breathing deeply and leaning her hands on the counter, waiting for the pain to pass. Ethan, who was outside checking some papers, walked in just then and saw her leaning over, her face strained with pain. "Chloe," he asked worriedly, quickly approaching her. "What's wrong?" She tried to smile to reassure him, but the pain wouldn't let her pretend. I think the baby is ready to come," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan felt fear and excitement flood him at the same time. He knew the moment was close, but he didn't expect it to be so soon. "We have to go to the hospital," he said urgently, grabbing the keys and carefully helping Chloe to stand up. The trip to the hospital was a mixture of tension and emotion. Chloe breathed slowly, trying to stay calm while Ethan drove with one hand on the steering wheel and the other holding hers. Every now and then he looked at her, trying to make sure she was okay, although the latent fear in his chest made him feel helpless. Upon arriving at the hospital, they were quickly received by the staff, and Chloe was taken to the delivery room. Ethan, though anxious, stayed by her side the entire time. The hours that followed were long and exhausting. Ethan had never felt such an intense combination of fear and excitement. As he held Chloe's hand, he saw the effort and pain on her face, but also the incredible strength she showed in that moment. The admiration he felt for his wife grew with every second. Finally, after what seemed like endless hours, the cry of a baby broke the tense silence of the room. Ethan and Chloe looked at each other, their eyes filled with tears of happiness and relief. The doctor lifted the baby, and as he placed her on Chloe's chest, the room filled with a peace they hadn't felt in months. "It's a girl," Ethan whispered, his voice broken with emotion. Chloe, exhausted but radiant, looked at her daughter with tenderness. She stroked the baby's soft skin, whispering words of love as tears rolled down her cheeks. Ethan leaned in, hugging them both, and for a moment the outside world disappeared. They were a family. Hours later, as Chloe rested with the baby in her arms, Ethan stepped out of the room to get some air. Despite the joy he felt, he knew the work was still waiting. The storefront was almost ready for the grand opening, but there were still some details to resolve. As he looked out the hospital window, he thought of his father, of everything he had left behind, and how destiny had led them to this moment. The fight with his family, the closed doors, the daily struggles, it had all been worth it to get to where they were now. However, his father's shadow remained present though distant. He knew Charles had tried everything to make their lives impossible, but what he hadn't been able to foresee was that the love he shared with Chloe was much stronger than any influence or power his father could exert. But the doubt remained latent. Was he truly free from his family? A few days after the birth of their daughter, whom they named Sophia, the storefront's grand opening finally arrived. Chloe, still recovering, supervised the final details from a distance, while Ethan and some close friends helped prepare everything. There were balloons, flowers, and a simple but meaningful sign at the entrance, Sophia's Sweets. The opening day was a success. Neighbors, regular customers who had tried the baked goods before, and some curious newcomers entered the small space, drawn by the delicious aroma and the cozy atmosphere. Ethan and Chloe couldn't believe it. After months of sacrifice, hard work, and obstacles, their dream had finally come true. However, amidst the joy and bustle of the opening, Ethan noticed a familiar figure among the customers entering. Charles, his father, had arrived. Ethan felt a knot in his stomach. He didn't know what to expect from him. They hadn't been in contact for months, and the last time they spoke, things hadn't ended well. Charles, dressed in his impeccable suit, slowly approached the counter where Ethan waited, his face serious. "Ethan," Charles said, his voice sounding less authoritarian than usual, "I wanted to see how you were doing." Ethan looked at him, unsure if his father came with good intentions, or if it was just another strategy to make him feel like he had failed. "We're doing fine, Dad," Ethan replied calmly, although emotions churned inside him. "I don't need your approval." Charles observed him for a moment, and in his eyes, for the first time, Ethan saw something he didn't expect: tiredness. His father, the man who had always been the figure of unbreakable power, seemed older, more vulnerable. "I didn't come for that," Charles said, taking a deep breath. "I came because I've been thinking. Maybe I was wrong. I didn't expect you to get this far. And us." Ethan didn't know what to say. His father's words left him stunned. For so long, he had fought to prove that he could do it alone, without depending on the family fortune, and now, in front of him, his father seemed willing to acknowledge it. "Don't misunderstand me, Ethan," Charles continued. "I still believe this isn't the path you should have taken, but—" His voice softened, something Ethan had never heard from him. "I can't ignore what you've achieved. I came to congratulate you, despite everything." Ethan, still in shock, nodded slowly. "Thank you, Dad," he replied, not knowing what else to say. Charles lingered for a few more seconds, as if wanting to say something else, but finally gave a slight nod and left the space without looking back. Ethan watched him go, and a sense of relief mixed with confusion flooded him. Maybe it wasn't the end of his problems with his father, but at least for the first time, there was a glimmer of reconciliation, however small. When Ethan returned to Chloe's side, she smiled at him, holding Sophia in her arms. "What happened?" she asked, noticing the expression on his face. "My father came to congratulate us," Ethan replied, still incredulous. Chloe looked at him, surprised, but said nothing more. She just extended her hand to him, and as he took his small daughter into his arms, he knew that no matter what happened, nothing could separate them anymore. They had built something real, something of their own. The victory of love and perseverance. The morning sun gently streamed through the windows of the small bakery, illuminating the display cases filled with delicious creations that had made Sophia's sweets a success in the city. It was a normal day, but for Ethan and Chloe, every day in that space was a reminder of everything they had achieved together against all odds. Sophia, now a few months old, lay in an improvised crib in the back of the shop, giggling as she played with a small stuffed animal. Chloe, with a look of love and serenity, worked in the kitchen, carefully decorating a special cake for a frequent customer. Ethan was at the counter, serving customers with a smile that reflected more than just business satisfaction. It reflected peace, a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. After everything they had been through, from his father's threats to the moments of despair when nothing seemed to work, they had reached this point. They looked at each other and smiled, knowing that the most important thing wasn't the business's success, but the fact that they had built something real, something no one could take away from them. A family, a home, and a future full of promises. That afternoon, as the flow of customers began to dwindle, Chloe sat next to Ethan, stroking Sophia's small hand as she slept peacefully. "Do you remember the first days?" Chloe asked with a nostalgic smile. "Everything felt so uncertain, and now look where we are." Ethan nodded, clearly recalling those days full of doubt. They had had so many questions, so many sleepless nights wondering if they could truly make it. But he also remembered the small victories, the moments when they felt they were moving forward, even when everything seemed against them. "It wasn't easy, but it was worth it," Ethan replied, taking Chloe's hand. "Every sacrifice, every obstacle, it all brought us here." Chloe looked at him, seeing in his eyes the same strength and determination that had won her over from the start. Despite everything they had lost by defying his family, he never regretted his choice. He had chosen love, and that love had sustained them through the darkest moments. "Sometimes I think about what things would have been like if we had given in," Chloe said with a touch of reflection in her voice. "If you had done what your father wanted, if I had let the pressure separate us." Ethan shook his head gently. "We can't live thinking about what could have been. Everything we've been through has brought us here, and I wouldn't change anything about what we have. Look at Sophia," he said, pointing to their little daughter. "She is the proof that every decision was the right one." The silence that followed was one of peace, of a deep understanding between the two. They knew their path hadn't been the easiest, but it had been theirs, the one they chose together. Suddenly, the shop door opened gently, and both looked up to see Charles, Ethan's father, enter with slow steps. The tension that would have been palpable in his presence before was not there now. On his face, you could see that something had changed in him too. He was not the same man who had tried to control his son's life, to impose his desires on him. Charles walked up to the counter, looking around the space. His eyes stopped on Sophia, who was still sleeping peacefully. "She's beautiful," Charles said in a low voice, breaking the silence. "She looks like her mother." Ethan exchanged a quick glance with Chloe before nodding. He knew his father's words were not just a compliment. They were an acknowledgement, something he had never expected to hear. "Thank you, Dad," Ethan said, approaching him. Charles took a deep breath, as if struggling with something he had held onto for a long time. Finally, he let it out. "I was wrong, Ethan. I was wrong about so many things," he said with a tone of vulnerability he had never shown. "I thought what I wanted for you was the best, but I was blinded by my own pride. Seeing what you've built here, your family, this business, makes me realize that money or power aren't always the most important things." Ethan felt a heavy weight lift from his chest. He had waited so long to hear those words, and although he didn't believe everything could be fixed immediately, it was a step towards something better. "All I ever wanted was to be happy with Chloe and my daughter," Ethan replied, his voice soft but full of conviction. "I wanted you to see that, to understand it." Charles nodded slowly, looking at his son with a mixture of regret and respect. "I see it now, and I regret putting you in the position I did. I'm not here to ask for anything, just to tell you I'm proud of what you've accomplished." Ethan felt tears well up in his eyes, but he swallowed them, staying firm. He extended his hand to his father, who, after a second of hesitation, took it. The gesture, though simple, was the beginning of something new. Chloe, observing the scene, felt a peace she hadn't felt before. She knew Ethan had carried the weight of his father's disapproval for so long, and seeing that reconciliation, however small, was a necessary closure for both of them. After Charles left, the shop filled with silence again, but this time it was a silence of hope. There was a new beginning, not only for Ethan and Chloe, but also for the relationship with the family he had left behind. "Do you think things will change from now on?" Chloe asked as she rocked Sophia in her arms. Ethan looked at her, reflecting for a moment. "I don't know," he replied with honesty. "But the important thing is that we are good, and that won't change. Everything else will come with time." Chloe smiled, leaning her head on Ethan's shoulder as they watched the sunset through the window. They had started with nothing, facing the biggest adversity they could imagine, but they had triumphed. Not because they sought wealth or success, but because they had done it together, driven by love and mutual trust. And in that moment, as they held their daughter and sat in their small business, they knew that true success was not material, but the family they had built. A family that flourished against all odds, proving that love and perseverance can conquer even the greatest challenges. The future was uncertain, but Ethan and Chloe knew that no matter what happened, they would move forward, always together. And that was the greatest victory of all. What did you think of this story? There are many people who, like Chloe, are fighting silent battles every day. Our hope is that her voice has also resonated within you. If this story touched your heart, share it. Make more people feel accompanied. Be part of the change. Tell us in the comments what you would have done in her place. Which city are you watching us from? Reading you makes us feel closer to you. And if you haven't done so yet, like, subscribe, and hit the little bell. Every gesture from you is a sign that these stories must continue to be told. Don't go yet. Our next moving story is already appearing on your screen. Click on any of them and continue exploring this universe of real, moving, and necessary stories. Thank you for being here. Thank you for feeling with us. We send you a huge hug wherever you are. See you in the next one.